Welcome to Holland's Hidden Heroes. I'm Lillian, and together with my 11-year-old co-host Colin, we share amazing stories from Dutch history. During the Second World War, hidden in the heart of the Netherlands, right under the noses of 200 Nazi soldiers, a secret village arose. Jewish refugees, Allied military, resistance fighters, and even a deserted German soldier lived here, in huts beneath moss, branches, and leaves. In this episode, we'll take you inside this hidden world, how it was built, who lived there, and what life was really like in the shadows of war. Step with us through the story beneath the trees. When the Germans occupied the Netherlands, there were a lot of people who went into hiding, mainly Jewish refugees, but there were also a lot of Dutch people who were trying to flee from the forced labor, the so-called Arbeidseinsatz. And this also happened in the town of Nunspeet. Those people were taken in by the locals in their houses. And nearby Nunspeet, there were 200 Nazi soldiers stationed, SS soldiers, who continuously were looking for people in hiding. And any form of help to people in hiding was always punished by the Germans. But the houses of the Nunspeet locals gotten too full. There was no place for other refugees, and it also became more and more risky because they had so much people in their homes. And the Nazis did regular checkups. So one of the new refugees got a small caravan, a sort of shepherd's hut. And they placed that hut in a forest and they covered it with leaves, with branches, as a natural camouflage. And a few resistance fighters had gotten involved. Their names were Grandpa Bakker, Aunt Cor, and Boom. And the last one has gotten his name because he had a very explosive character. So these are all resistance names, because their real names were never shared due out of safety. The three of them met each other, and they discussed the problem of so many people in the area who were trying to find a place to get into hiding. They were curious and they were looking into the possibilities to find a solution for this problem. And then they found out that the small caravan, the shepherd hut, really seemed to work. Even though the Nazis were still inspecting the area and the forest, they hadn't found the little caravan. And that brought a new idea to mind. Let's build a hidden village for 100 people in the middle of the forest. And this forest was placed next to a road which was called Pas op, translated watch out. And this was the start of the hidden village, a watch out camp in the middle of the forest of the Veluwe. And Colin, you can take us through how the hidden village was built.
They looked for a secluded, densely forested area at the Veluwe where there were no paths or roads, a place with very high trees. A lot of those trees were pine trees. They chose a place in the Vierhouterbos, perfect because of the dense plants, and to be able to flee if needed. The underground huts had to be invisible from the air, noise-canceling, and have enough space for multiple people. That's where they started to build, and over time, more huts kept appearing. In the end, 9 huts were built on 4 areas, with fire breaks in between, so a fire could not spread to the other parts. The biggest hut was 9 by 5 meters. They could not stand straight in the hut, and they slept on wooden beds. It was all very simple. Around 8 to 10 people slept in one hut, and the floors were covered with straw and potato peels. The walls were isolated with straw, so they could be more noise-canceling. No official building plan was made, so the Germans would not find it. Everything was done secretly by feeling and experience. Materials came from the forest or local farms. There were no modern machines like there are now. They used wood from the forest, like logs, for the structure of the huts. They also got materials from the people living nearby, such as windows, pots, and pans. The builders, including some of the people in hiding themselves, dug holes in the ground to about 1 to 1.5 meters deep. The roofs were covered with sticks, sand, moss, and leaves, a form of natural camouflage. The walls were made stronger with wood or peat and covered with blankets of burlap sacks on the inside. In some of the huts, stoves were built, made of bricks or iron, with a pipe that carried the smoke through a long tunnel. It was very wet under the ground, so the stove had to stay warm. This way they could also cook. Because the area was so densely forested, you couldn't see the smoke from outside. There was a kitchen, bedrooms, toilets, a common room, and storage. It was like a small village. The toilets were very simple, a hole in the ground away from the huts. There was no running water, but they did build a well in the village. Work was constantly done on improvement and camouflage to avoid being discovered. Many local people helped with the building. There was a lot of sewing and carpentry. A plumber came to build the well. Many materials had to be brought in. All this work made a lot of noise, so they had to be careful and people were always on lookout.
About 80 to 100 people lived in the hidden village. Some stayed a few weeks and others stayed for months. About half of the hidden people were Jewish refugees. Families, children, and elderly. Some children even came alone, and they were cared for by the others in the village. Dutch people who refused the forced labor, resistance fighters, like students, but also policemen, and there was also armed resistance. But there were also Allied military who fought behind enemy lines, like British pilots, who were shot down over the Netherlands during the Battle of Arnhem, like Kenneth Parson and Geoffrey Mallison. There was also a Scot, Captain Charles Bruce Noble, and he was a surgeon Royal Air Medical Corps. He had jumped out of a riding train when he was prisoner of war. There were also American pilots, like James Wilson from Boston. Each of them had their own story and lost a few people they worked with in the military. But when they arrived in the village, they brought hope to the people who were already there, because a lot of the Dutch people had been in hiding since the beginning of the war. So they were very happy that the liberators came, even though they also ended up in the village. But we knew we weren't forgotten and there was still fighting for freedom. The Dutch resistance was in contact with the British authorities and could tell them which Allied military stayed in the hidden village. But there were also other military present in the village, like a soldier from the Soviet Union who didn't speak any English or Dutch, so it was very difficult to communicate. There was an Italian soldier, and there was even a deserted German soldier, which caused a lot of panic and distrust, especially among the Dutch. It took weeks for him to gain everybody's trust and to be part of the people who lived there. Well, to keep a hidden village like this running, and the people who live there can't leave the village themselves, it requires a lot of organizing and a lot of help from the outside.
Food was needed, a lot of food for so many people. For example, meat and bread, but also other food. That was very complicated because since 1940, every Dutch person got a booklet for identification. With that booklet, you could get food stamps, and you could use those to get groceries, so you couldn't buy what you wanted, but could only get food with the stamps. The amount was decided by the Germans, so you couldn't get extra food. In newspapers, advertisements were placed where you could pick up the food stamps. That didn't apply to the people hiding. You could get vegetables without a stamp, though the surrounding farmers secretly delivered it. They traded illegally cut wood for fish. Women from the village helped by making and preserving jam. Boom took care of pigs, which they turned into small pieces of meat. Grandpa Bucker, Aunt Cor, Boom, and their helpers had to negotiate everywhere and make deals to provide the people in the village with the food they needed. Everything was on the black market. They had to be careful so they wouldn't get caught. Because of their work in the resistance, they luckily had a big network and already knew many people they could trust. They also got more and more food stamps, with officials helping too. Later in the war, the resistance printed illegal food stamps and people traded them. The village also needed coal to stay warm. They stole it from the Germans with help from the resistance through a clever deal with the director of the Dutch Coal Trade Association. But they needed more medicines and items to entertain themselves, like books and board games against boredom. But also school books that mostly came from the local people, that was brought by horse and cart, on foot or by bike. There was no fuel, so hardly any cars drove anymore. On the way to the village, they were often checked by the Germans, so the goods had to be well hidden or they lied to the Germans about what they were doing. Some people also got sick or came back hurt, like some of the soldiers. Local doctors helped with treating the patients who came through the hidden village. It all had to be very secret and at night to stay out of the German sight. Sometimes a hospital stay was needed. There was also a hospital nearby that secretly treated people in hiding. The patients had to be transported at night by cart or on foot.
Grandpa Bucker, Aunt Cor, they run the village. And Boom is more in the background. He takes care of the financing and making a lot of deals. The people in the village could go outside the huts, but they needed to stay at their part of the village, not crossing the fire breaks, only when it was really needed, like getting some water. The village could not be detected from the sky. The people always needed to whisper, always needed to be quiet, which was very difficult, especially for the children. There were also people who continuously were standing on guard to spot any Nazis. A lot of locals helped out in providing the goods, as Collins just shared with us, but also some policemen helped in transporting the people from and to the camp, pretending they were prisoners. A lot of people knew about the camp because they helped out, but this also increased the risk and the chance of being betrayed. There were always difficult situations to face in the village. There was a language problem, which also sometimes caused hilarious situations. But there were also difficult times, like a British pilot who was brought in and was severely wounded. He had an infection, and only penicillin could save his life. Now, back then, penicillin was not known in the Netherlands yet. They didn't use it, so the Dutch doctors had heard of it, but only from other people using it in the UK or in the USA. So the Dutch resistance contacted the British authorities, and the RAF, who always dropped weaponry and medicines to the Dutch resistance, made sure the penicillin was in the package, and this way the British pilot was saved. One day, an American pilot was crashed right above the hidden village, and he came down with his parachute. Immediately, the Dutch resistance started a search team because they knew the Nazis would be sweeping the forest, so they needed to bring all the people in hiding to safety, but they also needed to look for American pilots, and they were lucky to do so. So he could also live in the village. They always had to live in fear, always on the lookout. And this caused all kinds of mental issues. Like there were a lot of stress and they kind of lost hope, so there was depression. But there was also a lot of conflicts and fights among the people. And they had to face another enemy, boredom. Because staying underground most of the day and only getting out at night makes it very difficult to have a sort of normal life. And it was a very different world where there wasn't as many communication possibilities as today. So they hardly had any information what was going out in the outside world. So they listened to the radio BBC now and then, also with the Allied military. The resistance fighters who got outside shared some news, how it was going with the war. There were board games, there were books, education material. And the military who lived in that village also struggled. It sometimes felt like a prison, they would later declare, because they had to stay so much underground. And they just told the people it was important to exercise, mentally and physically, because you stayed so much underground, you had to have some exercise during the day. And it was important to bring structure to help fight the depression. So the military helped to bring that. Sport equipment was secretly brought to the camp to help that out. It turned out that a deserted Nazi soldier was a gym teacher, and he helped the family exercising. The whole village also trained in case of an emergency and they needed to evacuate. The military helped with this training. They also helped some of the resistance to explain more how the weaponry worked and how to use that. Several times the Nazis searched the woods. It's been a close call a couple of times. And despite all the differences, the conflicts, the fights the people had among each other, every time it's gotten into a difficult situation, they all helped each other out. Colin, could you tell us what happened next?
On October 29, 1944, things went wrong. By chance, 2 German soldiers who were hunting saw a boy from the village fetching water. They talked to him, and even though he didn't say anything about the village, they sensed something was wrong. The Germans hurried back to their base to get reinforcements. This gave the people in hiding time to escape, as they had practiced many times before. They hid in the surrounding forests and nearby farms. The resistance helped them find new hiding places. Most people escaped from the Germans, but unfortunately, 8 Jewish people in hiding did not survive, including a 6-year-old boy. They were executed by the Germans. This is how the story of the hidden village ends. The Germans blew up the camp with grenades, and it was completely destroyed, as if the village has never existed. For a long time, nothing was left. It is not known exactly who lived there because no information was written down. That would have been too dangerous. That is why not all names are known, and the stories were told years later by survivors and witnesses. But in 1970, 3 huts were rebuilt, which you can now see in the Veluwe in memory of all the people who lived there and their helpers.
This story reminds us of the heroes of both the Netherlands and the Allies and how they all worked together, each of them with their own personal story. It reminds us of the sacrifices they made so we can live in freedom today.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or other platforms. And don't forget to follow us on our socials, where we'll keep you posted on upcoming stories. You'll find the link in the show notes. One hidden hero at a time.
Holland's hidden hero standing strong.